This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Hello and welcome to today's Critical Thought. Before we get going, thank you to 960 subscribers here on YouTube. We are really getting close to 1,000 now. I hope everyone is enjoying the content, and for you first-timers, be sure to like and subscribe, because I think at this rate we may actually hit it before the end of the year. First, some good news and bad news regarding my PlayStation 4 streaming. The good news is I managed to record a video and it will actually be up tomorrow on the YouTube channel. I decided to play some Resident Evil 7, the demo, because I was really excited about that. The bad news, it turns out, is that they don't have a lot of the older PlayStation 2, PlayStation 1 games on the PS4 store like they did with the PS3. Which means I can't stream Fatal Frame or Tomba or Parasite Eve or all those other great games. For those of you who have a connection with Sony, please send them a message for me and tell them to get on that, because I would love to show you guys some of those games. But that video will be up tomorrow. Also, for Thursday, it will be time for another episode of Game Wisdom Live we missed last week. And as of right now, we're going to have some special guests this week. My friends from Plastic Games, who made Bit Shifter, will be on as our guest panel for our topic. So be sure to check that out. Remember, that's going to be around 7:30 EST on Twitch, because it seems like there's more interest in doing the live streaming over there. But with that all said, let's get to today's topic. And I'm sure this will be a topic that no one will say anything bad about, and we'll all be singing Kumbaya by the end of it. And that is male gaze versus the power fantasy. Like I said, very simple topic. No one's going to have anything bad to say, right? As we've seen in the last few years, the rise for more inclusivity with the game industry has certainly grown, with incidents such as Gamergate, discussions from people like Anita Sarkeesian, and so on. And one of the basic arguments has to do with the concept of the male gaze. And for those of you who watch these videos, my regulars, I think what we're going to talk about today, most of you will probably say, duh, we already know that. But I think it's important to get this down in video form, and maybe to be used in the future for people who are trying to argue against it. But the male gaze in its simplest form is essentially when a game or situation is tailored specifically towards men. And we have several examples of that I want to talk about today. One that is commonly brought up that is an example is the idea of men barely wearing any clothing, muscular men, stuff like Kratos, the characters from Soul Calibur, pretty much any real fighting game with men with male characters in it. And the problem is, at its basic form, is that a man who is, not wearing any clothing or barely wearing any clothing is not in the same connotation as a woman who is barely wearing any clothing. And this is where the idea of the power fantasy comes in. Power fantasy essentially has been around, I think, almost forever at this point. As long as there's been literature, as long as there's been storytelling, there has been the elements of the power fantasy, where you'll have, manly men who are going to save the day. They're going to beat the bad guy, save the princess, get the girl, be the hero, etc. It's the idea of escapism. You're trying to project yourself into this character because you want to be the hero. There was a famous interview, I think, by David Jaffe, who did God of War, and he talked about the creation of Kratos. And he said in the interview that Kratos was basically designed to be his wild side, or his id. This is who he envisioned himself he would love to be. The badass guy who doesn't take crap from anyone, who's just going to kill anything that gets in his way. And that is usually the most common form of the power fantasy. Now, like I just said, when it comes to gaze, male gaze or female gaze in the power fantasy, they are usually exclusive. Some people will argue that it's okay to objectify women because men are always killing games. That doesn't work, and we don't have the time to talk more about that topic here today. But when it comes to showing the male form versus the female form, the situation and the setting will usually have a good sense of whether this is power fantasy or gazing. there's a really good example of this in the Mass Effect series, which I think I used this screenshot for one of my first posts on it, which was when Shepard's talking to one of the characters, and I'm sorry, I haven't played Mass Effect yet, so I don't know their name, but the whole scene was shown while they're talking, showing her butt from the basically as like the front and center of the scene, while Shepard's over here on the right hand side. That is the almost the perfect definition of a male gaze. And male gaze definitely has to do with voyeurism. There you go. Where it's not just about showing characters, you have to linger on. You have to basically make sure that you are targeting the male demographic. And to wrap up today's critical thought, not now, but in a few minutes, I have the extreme examples of both. In most video games, male gaze is commonly used, again, whenever we're talking about approaching things from a power fantasy. If you're going to have the muscular men, then you have the women as objects, damsels in distresses, etc. Even if you're trying to balance things out, there can still be examples of male gaze, and Dragon's Crown is clearly an example of this. I've talked about this in the past. You have characters who are overly exaggerated in terms of their primary and secondary, or I'm sorry, just their secondary sex characteristics, you know, super muscular men, giant-breasted women, stuff like that. But then it goes a step further with the NPCs. The shopkeeper is a woman who is literally staying there motionless, except for her breasts, who are still somehow moving like they're being controlled by the moon's gravity or something like that. And when it comes to this, or when it comes to the male gaze, it's one of those things that is very rarely covert. You will usually know when something is considered male gaze simply in the first few seconds of watching it. Now, in an earlier critical thought, I talked about the concept of politically charged or taboo topics, and I'll be talking more about that probably in a future critical thought. But one thing to keep in mind whenever we're talking about topics of this nature is that there are different themes or different topics throughout the world. Something that one culture finds offensive, another culture will be fine with, and vice versa. As you know, in the United States, usually violence is considered more acceptable over sex. And again, that's another topic in of itself. But when it comes to video games, as in that earlier topic, I don't believe in censorship in any way, shape, or form. If a developer wants to feature male gaze and overly exaggerated female and male characters, it's within their right to do it. Like I said in that piece, I believe in accountability. If you're going to do that, then you have to understand the pros and cons. You are obviously going to get a lot of men interested in that game, but you are going to turn off your female audience. And again, as developers, you can't just say, well, I didn't know women were going to be offended because we put every female character in bikinis. How was I supposed to know? It doesn't work that way. Another major point of male gaze is the fact that when we see it, typically, basically sexiness or beauty is put first and foremost above logic and common sense. And there are many, many, many examples of that. There are games where you have characters who live in like the frozen north or in like swamps or disgusting areas, and instead of wearing clothing to protect them, they're in two-piece bikinis. The infamous boob armor or chainmail bikini are examples of this. There is a really interesting piece on Gamasutra, I think it was about a year or 2 years ago, where they broke down the fallacies with having just your chest being protected and nothing else, or just having, you know, your midriff showing while you have gauntlets on, and how that's not only practical or not practical, but it's just stupid. It's not realistic in the slightest. And that is, again, the typical example of male gaze, when instead of making something that makes sense or fits within the rules of the world, it's simply just there for voyeurism. And we can talk about quote-unquote fan service in anime as another example, but again, another topic we don't have the time for today. But like I said, if you're going to use it, you have to fully embrace, and you have to fully embrace the pros and the cons. As that famous quote I said from Mel Brooks last time, if you're going to go up to that bell, then you gotta ring it, or don't go up to it at all. Now, there's a very weird example of a developer going the right direction, and that would be the difference between Mortal Kombat 9 and Mortal Kombat 10. Mortal Kombat 9 featured many exaggerated female bodies. Katana, Melina, and the other, I guess, cloned forms there were barely wearing any kind of clothing. And then when they moved to 10, not only did they feature more women wearing better clothing, but they even added more clothing to those characters. And there's even a topic there we talked about on a podcast a while ago regarding avoiding tokenism and designing great characters. And we even brought Mortal Kombat 10 into that. But again, there's so many topics here that we just cannot digest in one critical thought. But let's wrap things up again with the extreme examples. And these are some that I've been thinking about since last night. This would be the perfect way to explain the difference between a power fantasy and a male gaze situation. So here goes. Here's the power fantasy example. Picture a warrior, man who's basically in a loincloth and nothing else. He's walking onto a field of battle. There's death metal playing in the background. As the camera pans up, starting from his feet and going up, you see cuts to his back where there's scars, there's bite marks, there's dried blood. As we keep panning up, we then switch to one of his axes that he's using. The axe has chips in it. The metal is breaking from so many times he swung it. There's blood dripping from it. Still going up, we get to his chest. Usually it's a six-pack. There may be tribal markings or even more cuts on it. Still zooming up. There may be a quick show of his arms, muscles, bigger than my head. And then we get to his face. He's snarling. He's got blood dripping. He looks like he's about ready to murder someone. And he stops in front of a huge army of enemies who are charging him. The death metal is blaring in the background. He lets out a roar. And then two falcons come down, land on his shoulders, and they start roaring with him. And then they start fighting. That would be a power fantasy right there. But there's no way you cannot. I mean, even thinking about it makes me want to play an action game. Now, here is the example of the male gaze version. This time, let's picture a female warrior. She's walking onto battle. Instead of walking in either sandals or barefoot like our male friend, she is wearing heels. Maybe like those stiletto heels that I could never even imagine wearing in my entire life. The camera is panning up again, but this time instead of death metal, we have insert any sexualized or sultry pop song of today. My musical knowledge base exists between the mid-60s and early 90s, for those of you wondering. So the camera is panning up again. Instead of scars, we see this, like a supermodel's legs. When it gets up, instead of panning to her back, it pans to her back side, which is barely exposed, because she's essentially, again, wearing a loincloth and just a very basic bra. Of course, it lingers on this for 5 to 6 seconds in slow-mo. Still the music's playing. We pan back to the front, this time going over her midriff that's exposed. Instead of showing any damage, it's still, perfectly smooth skin. We get to the breasts, who are now just, again, that kind of slow gravity that only exists in video games, and we linger again for another 5 to 6 seconds. There may be another quick shot of her face, who instead of her being, snarling or angry, she's, completely dolled up in makeup. She's got a sultry smile on. Still panning up. We get to the battle. And instead of letting out a roar, she may do like that hair wave, which obviously, as you can guess, I don't have the hair for that. The music is still going loud. And instead of letting out a mighty roar with her weapons, anything like that, she basically does like a little pose. And if you've ever seen like that infamous artist, I think Rob Liefeld, those kinds of super exaggerated poses, that's what she's doing to get ready for battle while these enemies are charging her. And again, that kind of voyeurism and just, again, focusing more on the sexiness rather than the combat of the situation itself is a very blatant example of a male gaze. And like I said, we're going to wrap things up here. There's still a lot more to talk about, but again, there are more facets of this to break down beyond just one critical thought. But once again, to sum things up, power fantasy and male gaze are not the same. Having muscular men is not the same as having overtly sexualized women. And I know some people may use the defense of it's okay to slaughter thousands and thousands of men, but we can't have women in sexualized clothing or whatever. Those two aren't equal. And to get into that topic, we'll need another 5-10 minutes, so maybe we'll save that for another time. Like I said, if you have any comments, be sure to leave them below. As often with topics of this nature, let's try to keep things somewhat friendly, or let's try not to get too mudslingy if we can. And once again, thank you so much for everyone subscribing. I really do appreciate it. And I am once again Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Be sure to check back tomorrow for my first bit of PlayStation 4 recordings. And like I said, when Bloodborne gets here, expect a whole lot of videos on that. But anyway, that's going to do it for now. Have a great night, and I will talk to you tomorrow live for our special episode of Game Wisdom Live. Anyway, see you all then. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.